Chapter 11. The Cubans. In 1987, summer slipped quickly into fall at the hot house, the weeks passing without incident until Friday, November 20th. Shortly after 9 a.m., Associate Warden Richard Smith got a telephone call from the Bureau's regional headquarters. Within seconds, he knew there was going to be trouble, big trouble, from an unlikely source. Fidel Castro had just agreed to take back as many as 3,000 Cubans who were now sitting in federal prisons. These were Cubans who had sought political asylum in the United States in 1980 during the Riots boat lift, but not quite qualified because they were either criminals or mentally ill. Getting rid of them after nearly 8 years was great news to Smith, but when he was told that the State Department planned to announce their impending deportation at noon that same day, Smith was appalled. Cuban inmates would be enraged by the announcement. A few of them at the hothouse had told Smith that they would butcher a guard if necessary to keep from being sent back. They knew that such a murder would result in their spending their lives in prison, but it would be an American prison, not a Cuban one, and that was worth killing for. The time of the State Department press conference gave Smith less than 3 hours to figure out what to do with the hothouse's 35 Cubans. They weren't really much of a threat, he decided, but as he put down the receiver, he wondered what the wardens at the federal prisons in Atlanta, Georgia, Oakdale, and Louisiana must have been thinking. Together, those two facilities held 3,000 Cubans. What could they possibly do in so short a time to prepare for the violence that was sure to come? Smith also wondered how people at the State Department could be so reckless. The so-called Cuban problem had actually begun in the spring of 1980 when thousands of Cubans swarmed the Peruvian embassy in Havana, seeking to escape Cuba's crumbling economy. A furious Fidel Castro announced that any Cubans who wanted to desert their homeland could, but only if they left through the tiny port of Riots. No Central American country would accept the refugees, however, so there was no place for them to go until then President Jimmy Carter announced that the United States would welcome the Cuban refugees with open arms and an open heart. Virtually overnight, 125,000 Cubans made their 90-mile journey from Riots to Florida ports, where they completely overwhelmed immigration agents. To make matters worse, Castro thumbed his nose at the U.S. during the height of the boat lift by emptying his country's prisons and mental hospitals in Riots. Months later, the Immigration and Naturalization Service would calculate that Castro had released 23,000 undesirables, yet federal agents were only able to stop 210 of them at Florida ports. Many of the others were arrested during the months that followed and were turned over to the INS for deportation. But Castro refused to take them back, so the INS had no choice but to house them in makeshift detention camps, mostly at old army bases. After numerous demonstrations and riots in the camps, the Justice Department forced the Bureau to turn the penitentiary in Atlanta into a prison for Cubans. In the beginning, Atlanta only held 1,844 men, but as the months passed, Cubans streamed into the badly dilapidated prison at an average of 100 new inmates per month. Worse, not all of the Cubans being sent to Atlanta were criminals or mentally ill. INS guidelines were so poorly written that even Riots Cubans who had no criminal backgrounds were detained for deportation if they were stopped by police for any reason, even traffic violations. This contributed to even more overcrowding. As the number of Cubans skyrocketed, the Bureau became alarmed. Finally, a federal judge in Atlanta ordered the Justice Department to establish some sort of review process so that Cubans who were not dangerous could be released. On paper, the procedure sounded good, but it couldn't and didn't work. Presidential candidate Ronald Reagan had promised to slash the federal budget, and funds for halfway houses and other social programs that the Cubans needed were first to go. A federal study would later reveal that only 50 Cubans out of 2,000 declared ready for parole were actually released. A second setback for the Cubans and the Bureau came when a federal appeals court ruled in 1983 that they were not protected by the U.S. Constitution because they were not U.S. citizens. That meant they could be held in prison indefinitely until Castro agreed to take them back, no matter what their crime was. Faced with drastic overcrowding at Atlanta, the Bureau built a $17 million alien detention facility in Oakdale in 1986. The only security at the 47-acre camp was a 12-foot high chain link fence, but the Bureau said additional security wasn't needed because only Cubans who were about to be paroled would be confined there. 7 months later, the Bureau reluctantly added a second 12-foot fence to the camp, dropped razor wire between the two fences, and announced that overcrowding at Atlanta was so bad that violent Cubans were going to be shipped to Oakdale. The mood at the camp changed dramatically. When it opened, the camp had averaged one incident per month, usually a fistfight. By the fall of 1987, it was reporting 30 to 35 serious incidents a week, including attacks on guards. When Richard Smith's telephone rang at the hot house with news that Castro had suddenly agreed to begin taking back the Cubans, the Oakdale camp held 1,039 prisoners. It had been designed for a maximum of 574. The Bureau would later compare Oakdale to a pile of dry kindling drenched with gasoline. All that was missing was a match, and the State Department was about to strike one. Normally, Warden Matthews would have received a telephone call about the Cubans, but he was out of town and had left Smith in charge. Smith didn't shrink from the job. He ordered the lieutenants to round up every Cuban detainee in the prison and lock them up in separate cells so they couldn't cause any trouble. The real leader of the Cubans in Leavenworth, however, was an American. Osiris Moheron had been born in Cuba, but was a naturalized citizen and had lived in Florida for more than 20 years before he was arrested for drug trafficking and murder. In 1981, Moheron and 9 other Cubans raided the hideout of another drug trafficker and seized more than 2 tons of marijuana. In the process, Moheron executed the 2 men who were supposed to be guarding the stash and also shot an innocent passerby who happened upon the robbery. At the hot house, Moheron had ingratiated himself with some guards because he was one of few Cubans who spoke English well enough to be understood. But while he was jovial and friendly, guards suspected that he was extorting money from the Cubans who didn't understand English and was casting himself in the role of a Cuban godfather. Edward George was in charge of Moheron's cell house, and when Smith told George that 5 members of the prison's Special Operations Response Team, SORT, were being sent to round up Moheron, the crusty officer suggested an alternative. "Hell, Dick, why don't you just go have a talk with Mr. Moheron?" he asked. "I figure the worst he can do is try to kill me." Smith thought George was kidding, but he wasn't. Without waiting for any backup, George walked down to Moheron's cell. "Moheron, we gotta lock you up," he said. "I don't know how long it's going to be for. It could be a day or it might be forever, but you were going to be locked up and that's not negotiable. Now, let's do it." George held up a pair of handcuffs. Moheron, who was sitting on his bunk, looked perplexed. "For what?" he asked. "Doesn't matter," George replied. "Now cuff up." Moheron rose. He was taller than George. His arms were 3 times as thick. "I said cuff up, and I don't aim to say it again," George commanded. Moheron stuck out his hands. A few hours later, Smith got another frantic telephone call from the regional office. Inmates at Oakdale were rioting. The camp was burning. An unknown number of guards were being held hostage. How long would it take for Leavenworth to send its SORT team, some 20 men, to Louisiana? "They're on their way," Smith replied. The next question was tougher. How long would it take for the hot house to be ready to house the Cubans from Oakdale once the riot ended? Like Richard Smith, Oakdale Warden J.R. Johnson had been notified that the State Department was going to announce the deportation agreement. But unlike Smith, Johnson didn't have any way to lock up his Cuban prisoners. At Oakdale, inmates lived in dormitories, not individual cells. Johnson had ordered his staff to quiet the prisoners' fears by handing out a printed memorandum. Cubans at Oakdale can help their chances to gain community release through continued positive behavior and respect towards staff and other detainees. Just in case the memo didn't work, Johnson ordered an additional 50 guards to stand by. All day Friday, he had walked through the camp reassuring the Cubans. None seemed to be alarmed, he noted in his daily journal. But that night, a drunk Cuban prisoner stumbled into the inmate dining room, and when guards tried to arrest him, other Cubans began overturning tables and smashing dishes. The guards retreated and let the drunk return to his dormitory. A short time later, several guards decided to go after him. They marched to the dorm, but the Cuban prisoners intervened and the guards retreated again. Humiliated, they then covered up what really had happened by downplaying the incident in their nightly report. A special task force appointed several months after the riot at Oakdale would later point to the dining room and dormitory fracases as pivotal. The cover-up was the first error. The second error was retreating twice. The Cuban detainees seemed to keep pushing the boundaries of bureau control and testing reactions, the task force wrote. Evidently, staff were not perceived as taking a firm stand. What happened the next day, Saturday, November 21st, is hotly disputed by Warden Johnson and his own staff. Several guards told the task force after the riot that Johnson was warned repeatedly that between 200 and 300 Cubans were planning to crash the camp's front entrance at dinner time to escape. The task force report noted that Cuban prisoners had started to prepare for trouble. Some began hoarding food. Others were seen putting on several layers of clothing. A few even taped magazines to their abdomens, chests, and backs, a common device to help deflect blows from nightsticks or knives. The task force wrote, information about these peculiar events was transmitted to the lieutenants and to the acting captain, who stated that he, in turn, informed the warden. The warden has no recall of these events being reported to him, although his log reflects he was contacted every half hour. When the shift changed at 4 o'clock on Saturday, the acting captain decided on his own to send all the women guards out of the camp. He also moved the extra 50 guards into the front entrance, but kept them out of sight. During the next 2 hours, nothing out of the ordinary was reported, but at 6:50 p.m., a mob of more than 200 screaming Cubans rushed the entrance. The extra guards jumped into view and fired tear gas. Surprised, the prisoners retreated, giving guards trapped in the camp time to evacuate. But they regrouped within minutes and attacked again, this time hurling back the tear gas canisters. Some Cubans swung broken mop handles. The guards were forced back. Now, the only barrier between the Cubans and the outside world was a 1/16 inch thick sheet of plexiglass. Warden Johnson sent 20 officers armed with 12-gauge shotguns and 38 caliber revolvers into the entryway. They were less than 4 feet from the angry Cubans pounding on the plexiglass. The guards waited nervously. They would be overrun if the Cubans broke through. A tiny crack appeared on the glass, and as the Cubans beat it, the crack inched its jagged way across the barrier in the shape of a lightning streak. If they break the glass, Johnson was later quoted by the task force as saying, "Shoot until you have no more ammunition left." For several minutes, the guards stood ready as the Cubans slammed against the barrier, but it did not give way. Everywhere else in the compound, prisoners tried to cut through the wire fences, but were stopped by guards wielding shotguns. Others lit fires or grabbed guards as hostages. Outside the camp, Lieutenant Charles Marmoleo donned an inmate's clothing and slipped inside. With the help of several American convicts who worked in the camp, Marmoleo led 9 employees to safety before he was recognized by the Cubans and forced to stop his risky treks inside. Guards Rick Nichols, Alvin Brendan, and Colton Duplechin weren't so lucky. Surrounded by angry Cubans, they took refuge in the camp's control center, which was located inside the compound, and watched helplessly as inmates set the building on fire. Dense smoke filled the booth. The 3 guards gasped for air. When they could no longer stand it, Nichols punched the button that opened the electronic door. Nothing happened. He punched it again and again, but it still refused to function. Nichols began slamming it with his fist. The smoke was so dense, it was impossible for him to see his partners. Finally, the door burst open, and Duplechin stumbled outside, armed with a stun gun, which shoots a non-lethal but hard-hitting beanbag. He aimed it at the Cubans, who backed away. Nichols came out next, but Brandon didn't appear. Still gagging, Nichols went back inside the smoldering center and found Brandon collapsed on the floor. He pulled her to safety, and with Duplechin's help, the 3 made their way through the Cubans to the fence. 54 guards had been in the camp when the Cubans rioted. 26 made it out. The others were hostages. As Johnson and his men watched helpless, one of their co-workers was paraded through the compound in a laundry cart, pushed along by whooping Cubans who beat on the side of the cart with sticks. The hothouse was in the midst of a $13 million renovation of A's cell house when the Oakdale riot started. This cell house was one of 2 massive cell blocks at the front of the prison, and Smith estimated that it would take about 3 months for the renovations to be completed. They could begin moving Cuban prisoners in then, he told his superiors. I heard a big sigh on the telephone when I said that, Smith recalled, so I suggested an alternative. If cost was no more object, the Bureau could kick out the private contractors, authorize around-the-clock overtime pay, and turn over the renovations to the hothouse's own staff of maintenance men. Those crews, plus workers flown in from nearby federal prisons, could finish the cell house in as little as 3 weeks, Smith predicted, but the cost to the taxpayers would be horrendous. For several seconds, the phone line was quiet, and then Smith got his answer. Go ahead and do it. Then it was Smith's turn to sigh. I was told the job would have to be done not in 3 weeks, but in 3 days. The Bureau needed all the extra cells it could find. Not only was Oakdale burning, Smith was told, but the Cubans in Atlanta had started a riot. When his Cuban prisoners first heard the State Department's announcement on Friday, Atlanta's warden, Joseph Petrosky, was able to convince them that they wouldn't gain anything by causing problems. But on Saturday, they learned from newscasts that Oakdale was in flames and grew restless. On Monday morning, they rioted and took hostages. Then a Cuban armed with a large homemade knife attacked a guard in the prison yard. He was shot in the head and killed instantly by a guard firing from one of the gun towers. For the next 10 minutes, guards shot down into the yard. 5 Cubans were hit. The shooting stopped only when inmates inside the main penitentiary threatened to begin killing hostages. Every available welder, locksmith, carpenter, and painter at the hothouse was put in to work A house cell block. There were no breaks. Employees didn't go home to sleep. When a guard finished his shift, he reported to A cell house and was handed a paintbrush. Maintenance crews from other blocks and other prisoners were hustled in. Warden Matthews hurried back from his meeting in California to help supervise. He and Associate Warden Smith quickly decided it would be foolish to put Cubans in the new cell house once the riots ended and the renovations were complete. Some of the locks hadn't been tested. More important, why should the Cubans be rewarded by getting the newest and nicest cell block at the hothouse? Instead, the U.S. prisoners living in the hopelessly outdated C and D cell houses would be moved. There was no question in Matthew's mind about whom he wanted to put in charge of the refurbished cell house. That job would go to Edward George, and the dangerous convicts that George oversaw would have first priority when it came to cells. We told the American convicts that they were getting the best cell house in the prison, Smith recalled. We also told them that we planned to do a real thorough shakedown for weapons and other contraband, but because of the Cuban riots, we needed their cooperation. Smith offered the prisoners a deal. If they were willing to move from C to D cell houses into A cell house without causing any problems, then we were willing to ease up on the shakedown. Overnight, more than 550 convicts, as well as all their private belongings, were moved to A cell house without a single incident. Without pausing, the work crews raced into the now empty C and D cell houses. Bunks were welded to the walls. All mirrors, wooden desks, and bulletin boards were stripped from the walls. Matthews and Smith didn't want anything left in the cell but a bunk, a fireproof mattress, sink, and a toilet. Smith had learned that Cuban prisoners frequently crammed the locks in Atlanta with hundreds of match heads. The sulfur from the matches reacted like dynamite when packed tightly in the locks and ignited. Other Cubans were skilled at picking locks. Smith had his guards bring in spools of heavy steel chain, which was cut into 3 feet lengths. A piece of chain was brought to each cell, wrapped around the cell door and bars, and then padlocked, making it impossible for the door to be opened without first removing the chain. Yards and yards of chain link fence were hauled inside and welded onto the outside of each tier. Smith also had steel doors built at every end of every level, in effect making each of the 5 floors into a separate cage. Still not satisfied, he ordered the crew to install a second door in the entrance of each cell house. This made it impossible for anyone to enter either C or D cell house without passing through 2 heavy metal gates. After 3 days of non-stop work, the hothouse was ready to begin receiving Cuban prisoners. A weary but proud Smith called Bureau headquarters in Washington to report that Leavenworth had completed the impossible. He expected to be congratulated. Instead, he got another jolt. The Bureau had originally told Smith that 200 Cubans would be sent to Leavenworth. Now that number was being changed. With both Oakdale and Atlanta still in flames, the Bureau had decided that it needed a new permanent home for the rioting Cubans. Smith was told to expect at least 700 Cubans, perhaps even more. At Bureau headquarters in Washington, Director Quinlan made it clear that he would negotiate a peaceful end to the riots rather than launch a Rambo-style attack to rescue the hostages. This patient approach took time, and during the days that followed, Quinlan was in constant contact with a new FBI specialist brought in to negotiate with the Cubans. There was one Bureau official, however, who was more worried about an American inmate running loose in Atlanta than the Cubans. Craig Trout, the Bureau's gang expert, considered Thomas Silverstein a deadly wild card. Of the 44,000 inmates in the federal system, none was more despised by prison officials than Silverstein. Nor was there an inmate more revered by white convicts. Terrible Tom Silverstein was accused of committing 4 grisly murders, all in federal prisons. One of the inmates he killed was Raymond Cadillac Smith, at the time the most powerful DC black in prison. That killing alone had made Silverstein a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, into a celebrity among white gang members. But it was the savage stabbing of a guard, Merle E. Klutz, at Marion in 1983 that so infuriated the Bureau that they put Silverstein under what was known as no human contact, the harshest conditions permitted by law. Since the Klutz slaying, Silverstein had been housed in a special isolation cell in Atlanta, where he was completely sealed off from other inmates. The lights in his cell were kept on 24 hours a day, and during the first 9 months that he was in Atlanta, Silverstein was not permitted a television, radio, newspaper, magazine, book, or reading material. Provided only with meals and a single set of clothing, which he wore, Silverstein was given nothing else to help pass the time. He sat alone in an empty cell with 2 guards watching his every move. Out of respect to Officer Klutz, the guards refused to speak to him. Over time, the Bureau had eased the restrictions slightly and had given Silverstein drawing pencils and paper, but he remained totally cut off from other inmates and the outside world. Now he was loose. The Cubans had broken into his cell and freed him. Trout figured that Silverstein would seek revenge. I was concerned that Silverstein would go on a kamikaze mission and simply start slaughtering hostages, recalled Trout. He was certainly capable of it. While others concentrated on the negotiations, Trout focused on locating Silverstein. There were plenty of reported sightings. A friendly Cuban told guards that Silverstein was building a motorized hang glider, which he planned to use to soar over the penitentiary's walls at night. The Bureau immediately instructed its guards to shoot anyone who came flying over the walls. Another story had Silverstein attempting to tunnel out under the walls. At one point, an FBI agent excitedly exclaimed that Silverstein was about to emerge from a tunnel. A heavily armed SWAT team raced to the spot, but he never surfaced. A few minutes later, an FBI sniper claimed that he had seen Silverstein on the roof of the prison hospital, about to use his hang glider. Another agent interrupted. He had seen Silverstein at the prison's back gate, and so it went. The Bureau's apprehensiveness about Silverstein can be seen in a confidential memo written by Warden Petrosky on November 28, which told guards what to do once negotiations convinced the Cubans to surrender. The memo, made public now for the first time, read, "Thomas Silverstein is a psychopathic killer and the most dangerous individual on the compound. It is not likely Silverstein will surrender and may hide out as long as he can. Once he is found, regardless of when and where, any action on his part other than total submission and surrender should be interpreted as a maneuver to assault, and he should be shot without hesitation." At Trout's urging, FBI negotiators asked the Cubans to surrender Silverstein as a sign of good faith. It worked. On November 30th, the Cubans poured chlorohydrate stolen from the prison pharmacy into Silverstein's morning coffee. When this failed to knock him out, more than a dozen Cubans surprised him and wrestled him to the ground. FBI agent D.H. Rosario, who was monitoring radio broadcasts, the Cubans were using portable radios taken from hostages, when he heard an inmate Cuban yell, "We got him, come and get him, now, now, now." Rosario rushed a team of U.S. Marshals to the door that led to the prison yard. The Cubans had used a pair of handcuffs and leg irons taken from the guards to restrain Silverstein. After the FBI dragged him away, a Cuban called Rosario on the radio and asked if the FBI would return the shackles. Rosario laughed. Later, he told reporters that the capture of Silverstein was a turning point in the negotiations. Each side had breathed a sigh of relief once Silverstein was in chains. Craig Trout knew exactly where he wanted to put Silverstein. The day after his capture, the prisoner was hustled to Dobbins Air Force Base and taken by private flight to Kansas. A hand-picked crew from the hot house was waiting. Associate Warden Smith had never met Silverstein, but Smith had known Officer Merle Klutz personally and had attended Klutz's funeral. As far as I'm concerned, Silverstein is a cold-blooded, bloodthirsty, worthless killer, Smith said. Even though he prided himself on being professional and objective, Smith was looking forward to seeing Silverstein's reaction when he was taken to the special isolation cell that had been prepared for him deep in the bowels of the hothouse. It had been constructed years ago as a concealed holding cell for hothouse prisoners whose location needed to be kept secret, usually because the mafia had put out a contract on their lives. Its walls and roof were made of 1-inch thick steel. The cell was buried underneath the rotunda in a section of the basement that hadn't been used for years. It was so isolated that you could not hear any of the familiar sounds of prison life. No human voices, toilets, flushing doors, clanging shut, televisions blaring, nothing. The cell itself was just as desolate. There was no bed, only a platform of concrete blocks with a thin mattress on top. There was no mirror, only a metal sink, a shower stall, and a toilet with a lid. There were no windows in the cell, no way of telling whether it was night or day, or cold or hot outside, or spring or summer, fall or winter. The only link to the world was a small black and white television set. Smith had installed the television to make Silverstein obey. If he refused to follow an order, the guards would shut it off. Because Silverstein was considered a prime escape risk, Smith planned to have 2 guards sit outside his cell and watch him around the clock. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to see him unless the lights in his cell house were left on. They would burn 24 hours a day. In effect, Silverstein was being put into an empty fluorescent lit cage. The lights would never be dimmed. The temperature would never change. The only sounds would come from the prisoner himself or the television. On the night that the legendary killer arrived, Smith was waiting. Although Silverstein was 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighed 200 pounds, he did not seem as big as he had been portrayed. He was pale and apparently had been drugged before the flight. He didn't resist, wasn't belligerent, and didn't react to the cell as the horde of officers escorted him down into the hothouse basement. Without muttering a word, Silverstein stepped inside the cage, turned his back on Smith and the others gawking at him, curled up on the floor, and went to sleep. The riots at Oakdale and Atlanta ended after 13 days. In the hothouse, Smith's telephone rang again. The voice on the other end was concise. They're on their way.